Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Pierce, and I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith, just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and one of your hosts for today's conversation. The Transnational Series focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. One of the very great joys of virtual events is collaborating with bookstores and organizations we deeply admire. And we are grateful to be presenting today's conversation in partnership with our friends at Third Place Books and the Center for the Art of Translation. Founded in 1998 in Lake Forest Park, Washington, Third Place Books is dedicated to the creation of a community around books and the ideas inside them. With locations in Lake Forest Park and Seattle's Ravenna and Seward Park neighborhoods, Third Place Books is proud to serve the entire Seattle metro area. Many thanks to their events director, Spencer, for inviting us to partner on this incredible event. And the Center for the Art of Translation's publications, events, and educational programming enrich the library of vital literary works, nurture and promote the work of translators, build audiences for literature and translation, and honor the incredible linguistic and cultural diversity of our world. As we continue on to today's conversation, I just want to offer a quick Zoom webinar tutorial. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a few icons. One of those is a Q&A icon where you can enter in your questions at any time during the conversation. Another button will get you to the chat window. That space is there for you all. Please feel free to continue to chat during the event. Spencer and I will be in the chat as well, dropping in useful information, including links to books by our authors. We do make every effort to keep these events free to attend in the hopes that you'll purchase the featured books from us. So thank you in advance for taking a look and supporting independent bookstores. And now I'm going to pass the screen to Spencer, who will be introducing today's very exciting lineup of speakers.
Thank you so much, Pierce. And thank you to the Transnational Literature Series. I don't know if you can tell, but I am grinning from ear to ear today because I've been looking forward to this event for such a long time. I'm very pleased to have the honor of introducing Isabel Fargo Cole, Hari Kunzru, and Dustin Illingworth, who are going to be discussing Isabel's translation of The Interim by Wolfgang Hilbig. First, I do want to thank our friends at the Goethe Institute, both in Boston and the Goethe pop-up in Seattle, for their support of this panel discussion. You will find few institutions as eager to support cultural opportunities like this. You can find more about their cultural programming at your local Goethe Institute at their website, goethe.de/en. And now I am going to introduce today's speakers. Isabel Fargo Cole is a Berlin-based writer and translator. Her translations include 5 books of Wolfgang Hilbig's, including Old Rendering Plant, for which she received the Helen and Kurt Wolff Translators Prize, as well as I, The Tidings of the Trees, The Females, and The Sleep of the Righteous. Isabel is also the translator of works by Adelbert Stifter, Annemarie Schwarzenbach, and Franz Fuhrmann. Isabel has also been the recipient of a prestigious Penheim translation grant, and her novel Die grüne Grenze was a finalist for the 2018 Preis der Leipziger Buchmesse. Hari Kunzru is the author of 6 novels, including the critically acclaimed Red Pill, Gods Without Men, and White Tears, as well as a short story collection, Noise, and the novella Memory Palace. Hari is also one of the Easy Chair columnists at Harper's and host of the Into the Zone podcast. He is an honorary fellow of Wadham College, Oxford, and has received fellowships from the Coleman Center at the New York Public Library, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the American Academy in Berlin. And finally, Dustin Illingworth is a literary critic who has written widely about Heinrich von Kleist, the poet Samuel Greenberg, Jan Fosse, Daša Drndić. Really, if there is a meteoric text in translation that has people excited, there is a good chance that Dustin is writing about it for publications such as the New York Review of Books, The Nation, or The New Yorker. Today, the book, of course, is Wolfgang Hilbig's The Interim, originally published in German as Das Provisorum at the turn of the century, and now we have 2 lines press to thank for this extraordinary translation by Isabel Fargo Cole. I hold in my hands here the bookseller galley, exclusive galley for this book, which is fairly demolished, as you can probably see. If today is your first time encountering Hillbig, then welcome. We are honored to kick off the publication week for this book with a discussion about this singular writer. So with that, Isabel, Hari, Dustin, the screen is yours. Welcome, and let's get this discussion started.
All right. Thank you very much, Spencer and Pierce, and welcome everybody. Thank you for tuning in wherever you are in the world. I think among the three panelists here, we represent 3 different time zones, so I hope our viewership today is similarly sort of international. I'm very excited to talk about Wolfgang Hilbig with our 3 panelists today. I started reading Hillbig in, I think, 2015, thanks to Isabel's wonderful translations. I started with The Sleep of the Righteous, I believe, and was blown away. And I think every time a new Hillbig book is announced, it's very much an event for me, and I think for Hillbig fans around the world. So very excited to be talking about him today and sort of evangelizing. But I thought a good place to start might be talking about your first experiences with Hillbig. You know, Hari, I'm curious what that first encounter was like for you. And Isabel, maybe you could tell us a bit, as both a reader and a translator, what was that like, and what drew you to his work initially?
Shall I go first? I mean,
yeah, sure. Hari, why don't you start us off?
Yeah. I mean, about around the same time as you, I think maybe a year later, I was living in Berlin for 6 months, and was thinking a lot about the former East Germany, and kind of I was actually trying to write material about the Stasi's surveillance of intellectuals in East Berlin, which turned into something slightly different. But yeah, I found Isabel's translation of I, and I was immediately struck by the kind of hallucinatory quality of the writing. I mean, and that seems to be, I mean, a characteristic of Hillbig. There's simultaneously this real kind of materiality to it, like you're very in all the kind of physical experience of being wherever he's taking you, but there is this kind of dreamlike quality to it. Everything is very confused and disconnected, and this story of this man kind of moving around in these, I suppose, liminal spaces, basements and forgotten spaces, and I've not really found anything like it. I mean, I don't know. I think everything's like Kleist, but it reminded me a bit of a certain atmospheres in Heinrich von Kleist, and yeah, and so I was very excited to see that there was this ongoing project of Isabel's of bringing these works into English.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have to say, just as an interjection, because I was wondering when I was reading The Red Pill, I got to the bits about the Stasi, I wondered if you had been familiar with Hillbig at the time that you were writing, and if that had fed into it in any way. And I was thinking, that's kind of the best thing that can happen as a translator, is if you bring a work into the English language, and it can then be fruitful for other people's work. So that's really really cool.
Absolutely, yeah. I ended up writing, I mean, about the Stasi surveillance of the punk scene in Berlin, but the feeling that Hillbig gave, the atmosphere, I mean, absolutely saturated what I was doing. So yes, thank you for that, Isabel.
And I think also just the moral ambiguity, and you had a very nuanced take on the Stasi story. So I thought that was it had something very authentic about it. So anyway, that's very, very cool. And okay, as my first encounter with Hillbig was, I moved to Berlin in 1995, and I was studying at the university, and a friend of mine who was very widely read, and I mean, my whole circle of friends was East German. I have to say, I really went native in the East, and so I was getting to know lots of writers I hadn't heard of before, and this one friend recommended Hillbig to me, and would read him aloud. And starting with some of these, he wrote very short, almost prose poem kind of things, very lyrical, and just this language and this rhythm and this imagery, it grabbed me. And that was at a point when I was really trying to figure out what was it like to live in East Germany. And there was something about his language, even though he's not the most realistic writer in many ways, although the Interim is something of an exception. There was something about this language that was so immediate and so so sensuous and so earthy that it really gave me a sense of this physically being in this world of the past that he's describing. So I read him for quite a while, and then at some point I started wanting to get into literary translation and thinking of books that I discovered that I felt should be in English, and found to my surprise that Hillbig, though he's an incredibly important writer and very very esteemed in Germany, his publisher had not been able to find an English language publisher for him, although they had tried for quite a while. So I just said, okay, I'll give it a shot. And then it took me 10 years, but eventually it worked out.
We're very thankful you did. So something that you both had mentioned in an email thread before the show here was the idea of just the powerful current of paranoia that sort of runs through the center of the Interim, and indeed a lot of Hillbig's works. There's the paranoia of C as he travels back and forth between two Germanys and really two sort of visions of what the world could be or should be. And there's this sense of profound sort of permanent surveillance that is, I think, in some ways legitimate, but in other ways somewhat irrational as well. And I wanted to ask you both if you see any parallels between this GDR paranoia that he's so good at capturing and our own sort of hyper paranoid moments, and what you think Hillbig might have to say to the contemporary reader on this front.
I mean, the experience of surveillance under the East German regime was that traditional 20th century experience of state surveillance, but the Stasi had this particularly worked out psychology around that. I mean, they were great readers of behaviorism, apparently, and you could go to the Stasi University in Potsdam and study Zersetzung, undermining or corrosion techniques for sort of dismantling the personal relations and the sense of self of the target of surveillance. So, I mean, surveillance wasn't just a sort of functional thing to get information. It was also a tactic to kind of, in some way, sort of destroy the ability to resist of political dissidents. But I mean, of course, our sort of feeling of being watched now has this strange sort of voluntaristic quality to it, in that we all carry around phones, and we all place parts of our private lives online. Maybe not entirely voluntarily, but that sort of, we collude in our own exposure. But I think the result is the same. I think there's a kind of undermining of privacy that is part of our experience now, and that certainly links back to experiences that East Germans had under that regime. I mean, the furniture is different. There's not a uniformed secret police kind of steaming open the mail and kind of bugging everybody's sitting rooms. But that's only because I mean, that's not. But the experience of that, I suppose, is what I'm saying is similar.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I had the experience. The first novel of his I translated, which is all about Stasi, the Stasi kind of interfiltration with the cultural scene in East Berlin. That came out in 2013, right, with the Snowden revelations. So, after for quite a while, I had been, sort of getting responses that, oh, well, the GDR is kind of, oh, it belongs in the museum. None of this stuff is relevant anymore. We're past all that. It's kind of interesting historically, and suddenly, here's someone who's writing about surveillance, and you realize, of course, actually, we have our own kind of a surveillance state, and our own kind of a non-state surveillance state in many ways. And there's no reason for us to look down on the East Germans for having put up with their surveillance. So that was interesting, and I think for me it was quite important to his work is important because he really shows the psychological mechanisms that operate behind surveillance. And it's not just, top down. It's, among people within a society, people are scrutinizing each other, and, the colleagues at the factory are, kind of looking to see if you're acting enough like a worker, or if you're acting like a snotty writer or whatever, or maybe if you're spying on them and writing notes, and who knows what you're writing about, and so forth. So there's a lot of surveillance going back and forth, which I think is similar to what, basically with the social media, you have people surveying each other on a grassroots basis, of course, controlled by corporate algorithms, but and I think that's incredibly sobering how quickly people have gotten used to that, and just kind of accept that as part of their, maybe not totally accepted, but find it very hard to extricate themselves from that. And I think that the kind of perspective that Hillbig has can maybe remind us that this is not supposed to be normal. We're kind of dealing with surveillance with a very smooth, slick interface, but he's reminding us that, kind of the messy, abyss beneath it, and the psychological mechanisms, and the pain and the shame and the, ugly emotions that are involved with feeling under scrutiny and feeling alienated by this kind of a system. And I think it's really important for people not to lose get out of touch with that reality, that we're now living with a normality of surveillance that I think even for most of us just 10 years ago, we would have never have thought that we would go along with it.
I'd love to know what the German take up of those sort of home surveillance speaker things are, the Siris and the Alexas and so on. I know, for example, you can have your residents removed from Google Street View under German law, and there's a much greater sensitivity to the intrusions of various sorts of digital surveillance, clearly because of this history that is, it's still very, very recent, really. One runs into plenty of people in Germany who have very direct experiences of this. But yeah, we're very blithe in the US, and I think in the UK as well, about certain sorts of state intrusion. It's and non-state intrusion. It's sort of terrifying how quickly, as you say, like the norms have shifted in the last decade around this, and there's not any really meaningful pushback against it.
Something else I wanted to talk about is the form of the novel, the form of the Interim, which I have to admit surprised me a little bit. If you haven't had a chance to read it, if you don't have a galley yet, or if you haven't purchased it yet, it's wonderful. Dark, obsessive, filled with the paranoia that we're talking about, but also all manner of confusion and the self-loathing of the artist, and all the kind of great stuff that a literary weirdo like myself loves to read about. But it did read to me a little bit more like a classic sort of German post-war novel than what I was used to in Isabel's wonderful translations of the shorter fictions, which are sort of in my take more like poetic and surrealistic in some sense. So I'm curious to hear if you had a similar experience, if this felt a little bit more realist in some sense. Just what was your experience in reading the Interim in light of Hillbig's other works that you've read so far?
Yeah, for sure. It reads much closer to one. One imagines that Hillbig actually had this experience of being a published writer in the West and shuttling on trains between West and East and feeling not at home in either place. In the character C writes about his bitterness, the wasted years of working in the factory before he could even begin to imagine himself as a writer and kind of become the person he, I don't know, maybe in the part he wanted to be. Who knows what he wants at the time of the narration of the novel. He's in a sort of state of alcoholic collapse and you know, these scenes where he's using the Gulag and Holocaust section of his personal library to wipe up his own vomit seems, you know, this is not a man with hopes and dreams still intact, but absolutely stylistically it feels very different to these shorter prose works, which are, I mean, my experience of reading those is like these, like shards and fragments that seem to kind of you know, they connect together in oblique ways. You know, if you lose concentration, you suddenly have this experience of jumping somewhere else, and that's very much part of the you know, everything is visceral, but nothing seems to be in the right order, and it's a sort of swirling experience. Whereas this is a more straightforwardly legible narrative of a Hillbig-esque figure, you know, having these experiences.
I mean, at the same time, it is also very nonlinear, as I think all of his work is. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think definitely it's in a very different vein, and of course, I noticed that while translating that it's a different material to work with. I think he does have this vein in certain of his stories that are more traditionally narrative or more character-based, and I think it gives him the space to kind of set up interchanges between sort of actual live characters. I think a lot of his work is very solipsistic. A lot of his shorter work, I mean, as is this book too, in a sense, the narrator, the protagonist is always very isolated, finds it very hard to connect with other people. In his shorter work, often in this very dreamlike, condensed poetic prose, you have kind of a poetic eye wandering around a kind of surreal landscape and experiencing, you know, encountering things that you're not sure are real or not. And this is definitely in this more realistic vein. I think that one reason for it is quite simply that it was very close to his biography. I mean, it is essentially part of his life that he's telling here. It is quite close to what he actually experienced. And I think it also has to do with the fact that he's really covering a lot of ground. I mean, his shorter work is often focused very much on this kind of coal mining industrial town where he came from, or it's focused on Berlin, on East Berlin. And here he's kind of opening up the stage. Has this writer who's traveling forth between the West and the East, and between these two, his East girlfriend and his West girlfriend, and his past and this kind of weird present that he can't quite fit into. And I think that he needed this kind of more, somewhat more traditional narrative style to fit all that in and still have it be legible.
I mean, I noticed having, I read The Tidings of the Trees quite recently as well, and that has, it's all set around this sort of garbage dump, one of these kind of very Hillbig-esque sort of location. You know, this is the detritus of a kind of a town. But there's a scene with mannequins where, you know, he thinks that they're kind of carting around corpses, and they turn out to be mannequins. And it immediately reminded me of the very opening of the Interim, where he has this kind of comic but terrifying interaction in a mall. Like there he is, he's this displaced person wandering around. Is he in Frankfurt? I can't remember. He's in a West German city, and he thinks he's being physically attacked, and kind of lashes out at the attacker, only to discover that it's actually a showroom dummy. And there's a kind of there's a thinness to other people. I mean, or the possibility of a social world. I mean, you said he's this sort of solipsistic presence. This I is very disconnected from any kind of possibility of community, and that kind of made that quite legible for me in his inability to connect with the people around him in this consumerized West German world makes him feel isolated, and he's expressed, I don't know, that seems to be very, very important for him to try and unpick that sense that he has of his own isolation.
in building off that previous question, and you've both mentioned this already, but there's this wonderful sort of material aesthetic in his work. It's something that Caleb Crane called in his recent New York Times piece, the secretionary Gothic, which I thought was a very nice turn of phrase. But I think, you know, Hillbig's second to none when it comes to describing, you know, objects and swollen rivers and bubbles of fat and ash heaps and abandoned machinery and things like this. And it's what I personally love most about his work, but it's very mysterious to me what he's trying to do, or what indeed what the work is doing to me. I wanted to ask you, what do you think he's attempting with this sort of sweaty and foaming deliquescent prose? And it's almost as if he's investing objects or the landscape, or at least the landscape of his memory, with kind of a consciousness of its own.
Well, he's also quite physically present as well. I'm kind of haunted by this. Like, he gets bought some what seems to be polyester underwear by one of the girlfriends. I think the East German girlfriend, and he's sort of sweating inside this fabric. And I mean, you know, and he's having all these kind of terrible alcohol-related gastric experiences as well. So while the other people are thin and ghost-like, his own physicality, or the physicality of the eye in the narratives is very present. But I mean, I take your point. There's a sort of excessiveness, isn't there, about this physical description? Everything is kind of breaking its bounds. It's very we're seeing the guts of things. We're seeing the kind of the viscera of whatever it is he's describing, and everything seems to be kind of heading towards a sort of rotten, deliquescent kind of existence. I mean, it's a bit like, I don't know, the early Laszlo Krasznahorkai books, which also have that sort of, you know, communist decay. I mean, maybe there's, you know, maybe we could kind of draw there's an aesthetic that's a kind of political disgust, a disgust that's to do with how rotten the society is, that seems to kind of figure itself in this very kind of material way.
Well, I think a lot of it just comes from his background. I mean, he came from a coal mining. He worked as a factory stoker and a factory worker. He was a child of the war. He was living in a bombed out town, surrounded by strip mines. I mean, this is the reality that he's confronted with. And he was just, had the guts to describe this in a way that was not what the East Germans wanted to hear about the working class. But he did find, I mean, he was very influenced by Gothic writing, by Edgar Allan Poe and romantic writers. So everything is kind of invested with a sort of a heightened quality, or a mystical quality, or a mythical quality too. But I think what's really unique about his descriptions, though, what grabbed me immediately with the first time I heard him, was that it sort of shimmers between beauty and ugliness, or disgust and sensuousness. And there's kind of a sense in which I was kind of thinking about this and realized that in the interim, the West for him is very sterile. It's very clean. It's very, colorful. It's shopping malls, but it's very, it's sort of disembodied. It's very kind of like this slick surface, or it's, watching pornography. You've got these bodies, these sort of perfect bodies that you're looking at that you can't touch. They're kind of disembodied. They're too perfect to be real. And kind of against that background, he feels more, you can tell that he feels more at home in the East. And the passages that are set in the East are more lyrical and more, you're really there. And so there's a sense in which this kind of ugly, very gritty physicality, I think, is really kind of grounding him, and is what kind of, it's something that's kind of, it's close to death and decay, but on the other hand, it's also something that's very alive and being in the body, even if he's someone who's not very comfortable in his body. It's just, I think it's something that he feels more at home with than with this kind of clean, sterile, sort of virtual reality of, I mean, the West almost seems like a computer game or something, the way he described it. It's too perfect.
Sure.
Isabel, can I ask a question about his publication history? Because in Interim, the writer is able to travel to the West and is giving readings there. And my understanding is that he wasn't at all published in the East. It was always West German publishing houses that published him. And how did that work? I mean, how one imagines, he would have been punished for kind of colluding with West German publishing houses.
Actually, I mean, it was kind of a complicated system, but he published a book of poetry in East Germany, I think around 1980, because the writer Franz Fuhrmann, who I've also translated, kind of stuck up for him and made sure that he got published, because he said, here's this young talent, he's a real proletarian writer, publish him. But it wasn't what they wanted to read. And then he got discovered by a West German publisher. And it was actually quite common at the time that East German writers would publish things they couldn't publish in the East, they'd publish them in the West. And actually the East German government let them do that and even kind of encouraged it, because the hard currency that the writers would be paid would get siphoned off into the state coffers. So they were earning off these writers. And, they would let people, as kind of, they would sort of dangle the privilege of traveling in front of you, so that, or they would, maybe just want to get rid of you if you were too troublesome. They'd say, okay, go travel, or go emigrate and do your thing over in the West. And it was actually the case that he published all the rest of his work with a West German publisher, and then eventually got this fellowship in West Germany, and basically just ended up staying there.
Right. So he kind of, was by default emigrated without really, I don't know, fully intending to.
Yeah.
I mean, much like the character in Interim.
Yes.
Yeah.
So speaking of all of those train rides to the readings, where afterwards he sort of despises himself and feels like he is a complete phony and will drink himself into oblivion at a nearby hotel. I was struck by his consistent feeling of performance throughout the novel with regard to his being a writer. And we read that, quote, he didn't even remotely exist in the form in which people had expected to see him, that he represented, quote, a public image for which he had no match. And so he's always he's never less than aware of himself as sort of a simulacrum of a writer. And not to put too fine a point on this, but I wanted to ask if you saw any parallels between this sort of divided consciousness of C, which I think in his case stemmed from that kind of fraught intra-German life that he was living, and the consciousness of the author in the age of social media, where you have the author is sort of as a media platform, as a performer, even as a brand in some sense, and then the actual person, sort of doing the writing behind that platform.
I mean, I found the self-disgust after public readings quite relatable, I have to say. But I mean, there's something quite historically specific, though, isn't there, about what's going on? Is that he's expected to play the role of the proletarian East German writer for consumption by these West German audiences, and there's a very particular kind of, he understands what they want from him. They want a kind of critical position, but they want to feel good about themselves for consuming this kind of lightly critical perspective, and he finds it impossible to embody that particular thing. But I mean, more generally, of course, there's always, it's a ridiculous thing that we will have to present when we're kind of, the work we do is very inward and very, very private, and then you have to sort of come out and present and it's like you do a performance, but you don't actually have an act. You just got it as you and your text. But so I found all the kind of the psychology of the reading writer that was amusing to me, because it kind of is, I've been in the hotel, drinking less than him, I have to say, but I've been in the hotel room after readings, kind of dissecting the awfulness of me and everything I have presented. Yeah,
my sense is also that that's kind of just the normal state. It's a normal state for, you know, the 99% of writers who aren't total, you know, extroverts. And but I do think that obviously social media takes that kind of performance and self-scrutiny and scrutiny through others and having to play a role, that takes it to a real extreme, where I also think that it's kind of maybe helpful to read something, you know, this perspective that reminds us that none of this is actually normal, or it is very normal and very human to feel this intense discomfort with having to sit on the stage and present yourself and present, you know, very, you know, these very intimate and personal things.
Did you ever get to hear him read? I'm curious.
Yeah, I did go to a couple of readings of his readings, and this is kind of during the very long phase when I was trying to find a publisher for him, and I would kind of go up after the readings and say, sorry, I still haven't found a publisher. And, you know, he took it philosophically. So I did kind of chat with him occasionally, but he was not easy to get, really to get to know. I mean, later I got to know friends of his who, you know, they'd been friends with him for years, but he was, you know, they all said that he wasn't, you know, no one really knew him. He was just very much, you know, he was a very isolated person in many ways. But I did see him read several times, and I also did have the sense that he was very uncomfortable reading. I mean, he was just, you know, he wasn't someone who could, I mean, I think sometimes he did enjoy it, or he would kind of be in panel discussions and he would, you know, sort of, he liked to be a bit provocative too, and, you know, or ask provocative questions, or kind of, you know, say things that, I mean, he did not have this, there's also this sort of this expectation that writers should be literary critics and kind of talk about their work in this kind of lit crit kind of way. And he could not do that at all. And so he would kind of burst into these discussions with just very different kind of way of talking about writing. So I think in some ways he did enjoy this public role, you know, when he was, you know, on his better days, but I think often he just felt very, very awkward, and you know, he had this very thick accent, and that I think he was also self-conscious about, although he was very, you know, really, you know, I identified with his accent and his roots, but it was very genuine. It's not an act that he's just kind of being coquettish about, you know, his artistic ego. It was just, I think it was really a torture for him to sit up on the stage.
Well, I think we've got about 5 minutes here before Spencer's going to jump on and start with audience questions. But I did have one final question for you, Isabel. Just, I believe, is this the 6th of his works that you've translated, or is there more? You lost count?
I've lost count at this point. Yeah.
Well, there's so many, and they're so wonderful, and have been part of my reading life for many years now, and I know many in the audience probably feel the same way. So I was curious, has your relationship with the work changed over time? And I'm wondering how you feel about the current state of his reputation, and what you think his continued prospects are for the future.
Well, first of all, I'm really thrilled that he's found this audience that I mean, I never would have thought, you know, when it was so hard to find a publisher for such a long time, that, you know, that he would become, you know, have this degree of resonance and you know, and to be inspiring other writers. I mean, it's just incredible. And I think Two Lines has really done an incredible job at finding an audience for these, you know, very, very, you know, often very challenging books. So I'm really very gratified about that. And I hope it will continue, because I think he is someone who has a lot, you know, speaks to a lot of you know, very universal, but also very contemporary issues. And yeah, I would definitely like to continue with the translations. And I find that as I've translated more and more of his work, I mean, one thing you notice while reading is that it's, in a sense, it's all one big text. It's you know, it has this, you know, he works with a certain topography, and there are a lot of motifs that will crop up, like the store dummies or the mannequins. or dust or ash or coal and all these kind of elements that keep kind of turning up in different configurations in different works. And so I am, the more I work with his, on his writing, the more I notice these kind of interconnections and these leitmotifs that crop up.
Great. Spencer, do you want to take over at this point?
Yeah, let's do it. We have a few questions coming in from the audience. I will say again, if you have questions for our authors today or about anything about German literature or the work of Wolfgang Hilbig, throw them in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, and I'm going to be appearing and reappearing and kind of representing everyone in the audience today. All right, let's get started. We have a question from Matthew Spencer, who's actually a skilled translator here in Seattle of Heinrich von Kleist. I will post about he has a new translation of Kleist's work, Anecdotes, that I'll post about in the chat.
Good.
And he asks, Isabel, did your work with 19th century German literature inform your approach with Hillbig?
Not really, because my the one 19th century book that I've translated, which is Adalbert Stifter's Motley Stones, I only just did recently, so that was my first crack at 19th century language. But I'm familiar with German, a certain spectrum of German Romantic writing, so I can kind of the Gothic era writing, so I can kind of I can identify those tones in Hillbig, but I haven't translated much 19th century work.
Can I just say that my copy of Anecdotes, the Kleist collection of short pieces from the Berlin Abendblätter, just turned up today, so I haven't had a chance to read it. I'm very happy. There's the balloonist section, which I had to sort of laboriously translate myself out of. My German is very, let's say, very slow to read in German, and I was very interested in all these images of balloonists in Kleist's final letters. But anyway, thank you for that, and I have nothing else to add other than you should go and buy that book.
And I think it's really cool that the Kleist Anecdotes have been. I've always thought that if he were alive today, he would be a blogger with his weird Abendblatt. Very cool.
Incredible. Kleist the blogger. I'll be writing that down and using it later. Charles asks a question for Isabel. Are any of your novels available in English? I believe I researched this and I don't believe they are, but you might have the final word on that.
No, they haven't been translated. There are some translation samples out there. But...
Alex Wells asks, you've talked about how C, who I can't remember if we've covered this, but is the protagonist of the novel, C feels the pressure to perform a kind of dissident East German role, one that he's not quite prepared to embrace. Are there parallels there with the reception of Hillbig in the Anglosphere? There was that recent New York Times review, for example, seemed rather eager to chalk his whole East-West disillusionment up to a totalitarianism hangover.
I kind of thought, actually, when I read that New York Times review, that there was it was in a sense similar to some of the, how the book was received in Germany, where, a lot of critics who had been very happy, when he was kind of eviscerating East Germany, got a little bit, rubbed the wrong way when he started being just as critical of West Germany. So there was kind of a sense of, maybe a slight similarity there, that you kind of expect someone to be, okay, he's the refugee from the dictatorship, so it's his job to criticize the place he came from. And but when he starts looking at capitalism, well, there he's going a bit too far. And I have to say, when I first read the book, I also kind of thought, back in 2003, I think, when it came out, I thought, oh, okay, this whole capitalism criticism, it's a little bit overblown. Yeah, okay, capitalism isn't so great, but I think he's exaggerating a bit. I have to say, in the meantime, my perspective has shifted somewhat, and I don't think his criticism is as exaggerated as I did back then, at any rate.
I mean, that whole sort of triumphalism of West Germany over the East in the wake of the kind of cultural triumphalism. There's never been a kind of comfortable place for people who grew up in the former East to express their sense of loss. I mean, that seems to come back again and again in German things I read, that there is this kind of all the criticisms are justified, but at the same time there was a form of life that just kind of vanished out of existence, and that people mourn that. They mourn their everyday. They have the nostalgie kind of idea, and I can see that Hillbig would make a lot of people uncomfortable because of that.
And kind of along those lines, we have a question from David, and he asks, can you talk more about Hillbig's in the German-speaking world and what his reputation is like there?
He's not as widely known as, someone like Günter Grass or whatever. So he's, he's very in the East. He's just, writers from the East. He's a real idol. I mean, not in the sense of someone you can imitate, because he's not someone you can imitate. He's just kind of there. But he's really something of a cult writer in many ways, and just incredibly respected because there's really no one like him. He was just kind of his own literature in a sense. He didn't belong to any group or school or anything. It was just, he was very much, he didn't have a lot to do with the whole literary business. He was very much an outsider. So he's in certain circles, he's just very well known and very respected, but especially in West Germany, he's still less well known. People are less familiar with him.
And we have a question here from Charles, who asks, can Isabel discuss the challenges of taking Hillbig's long sentences and rendering them in a smooth, elegant English?
It's not as hard as you think, because they are kind of somewhat disjointed. I have to say smooth. If they're too smooth, then I did something wrong. They shouldn't be too smooth. But you should, the reader should be able to go along with them. And there is a certain rhythm that propels them. And I've tried to keep that rhythm that carries you along through these often very elliptical sentences, but they're actually not structured much differently than they would be in English. They're not like the German, there's a certain type of long German sentence that it's like a box within a box within a box, and his are more, a long kind of worm or something, or a snake slithering along, I don't know. But yeah, I try to depend on getting a certain rhythm to keep, even if it's an awkward rhythm. I mean, it shouldn't necessarily be a smooth rhythm, but it should be something that kind of draws the reader along.
And we have a question here from Linda, who asks, or says, there seems to be a push in society to compare Germany and the US now. I am interested in how you would contrast the two. In translating a work, how difficult is it to get across an idea that is quite different between German culture and US culture?
I guess it depends a bit on the context. I mean, obviously there is difficulty, with the work that's very rooted in very specific sort of East-West German tensions like this one. I mean, there's a lot of kind of culturally specific or information specific to the time that he was writing in the late 80s, basically just before the wall came down. So I think there were, some certain cultural references in there that I had to kind of subtly, add a little bit of explanation to. And yeah, but I think basically I think in Hillbig, so many of the things that he's writing about are very elemental and very universal. And his protagonists are not really of they're not entirely of the society they're in anyway. So they're always kind of outside of it. So in that sense, you know, it's okay for the reader to be someone who's outside of that context too, because he's just as bewildered as you are, you know.
And Isabel, I think this is something you might have touched a little bit on during the conversation, but Greg asks, was Hillbig an author who interacted with and worked extensively with his translators? Have you had distinct experiences as a translator translating him before and after his passing?
Yeah, I just had very brief contact with him. So I spoke to him a couple times after readings. And then I think one time I was translating a short piece of his and I had a translation question. So I wrote him a letter and he wrote me a letter back very nicely and answered my question. I mean, a real letter, you know, and I think he's had email at some point, but not when I was interacting with him. But he wasn't someone who, I think he was just, I mean, I have to say he did have an alcohol problem. He was not someone who was terribly reliable about making appointments and so forth. And, you know, I think he was in contact with, you know, he was translated into a number of languages. And I think some of his translators did have contact with him, but I haven't heard that he would really, you know, sit down with them and go through their questions, or that, you know, you could necessarily depend on you know, getting his input, or that he would have, I'm not sure that he was even someone who would have been able to explain what he was doing. I don't think that he was consciously, you know, when we talked about what is he doing or what is his intention with this kind of physicality, I don't think that it was kind of he's sat down and thought, okay, I'm using this strategy here and I'm gonna use physicality in this way. I think it was just what, you know, came out of him in a very artistic way, but I don't think he necessarily would have been able to, you know, tell the translator, okay, I was trying to do this, this, and that, and these were my associations. At any rate, I felt a bit awed by him, and, you know, he seemed rather, I mean, he was always very, very nice, and he had actually very kind of, you know, warm kind of uncle-like aura to him, avuncular aura. But he didn't seem like someone that you could really kind of, yeah, sort of sit down and ask a lot of questions.
And this is a question, I think, this next question, I think all of you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on. David asks, or he says that Hillbig seems to capture more of an atmosphere that reminds me of Austrian writers like Ingeborg Bachmann or Thomas Bernhard. Is this his personal style, or do you see this as his personal style? And he says, I can't see someone like Yue Johnson being put in the same list of how intense and personal his writing is.
Yeah, well, I think Hillbig is he's a very Eastern European writer in a way. So maybe that kind of segues into Austria, which is very kind of East European oriented. And Uwe Johnsen was a North German, so kind of stereotypically sort of more straight-laced and distanced. So there might be some kind of a, you know, in the sense of the culture of, you know, Hillbig was kind of from Southeast Germany, from Thuringia, that there's maybe more of a kind of, and he always saw himself as being very Eastern oriented. His grandfather was Polish, and kind of tapping into this more of a, I don't know, Eastern dark mysticism or something. But I'm not sure if he had felt a specific connection to Austrian writers as such.
I mean, if that's a valid thing, you could kind of certainly connect, obviously, to Kafka, but also to non-German language Eastern European writers who have that kind of comfort with a sort of hallucinatory or surreal frame. I mean, that's, you know, you could see him a kind of as a more comfortable part of that tradition, maybe.
He makes me think of, I may be butchering his name. I'm monolingual, so I apologize, but Max Blecher. I don't know if I'm Blecher or Blecher. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but there's and I believe Matthew Spencer is translating him. I may be speaking out of turn there as well, but there's a similar sort of materiality and, as you know, surrealistic swelling of landscapes that my first time reading Hillbig reminded me of Adventures in Immediate Irreality is the name of Lecker's novel that I was thinking of. So I don't know if he took any inspiration from him, but I think.
I'm actually not.
Go ahead.
Oh, and I'm actually not familiar with that writer, but he sounds very interesting.
Oh, New Directions published a novel of his, I think in 2014 or 2015. I find it wonderful. I think it's great. And I see in the comments, Matthew is not translating it, but Sublunary Editions is going to be putting out some of his work soon. So look forward to that. It should be great.
All right, we are at the end of our time here, actually. I want to give a special thank you to Isabel and Hari and Dustin and, of course, Pierce at the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith. Gosh, and of course, Two Lines Press for publishing this wonderful book. Before we head out for the morning / afternoon / evening, do any of you have any final thoughts you'd like to give?
I just want to say thank you to Isabel for allowing me to read these wonderful works. They've been, like I said, a major part of my reading life. So I'm just, as a grateful reader, thank you very much for all of your hard work.
Yeah,
thank you. It's really wonderful to hear from from the readers that he's finally been able to reach.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Pierce, if you have any last words, then, or we can all just wave goodbye.
No, just thank you all. This has been incredible. Lots of love in the chat. Thank you for joining us.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.